In a police department where power is abused and silence cloaks every dark corner, one man walks in with unshakable resolve. David Johnson, the newly appointed police chief, carries a mission to dismantle the rot that has festered for years. From the very beginning, he faces harsh challenges, defiant officers, covert power plays, and dark secrets no one dares to confront. But David hasn't come to be liked. He's here to bring change. As he targets the broken values at the department's core, will he overcome the entrenched forces clinging to their influence, or will he be consumed by his fight against corruption? This is not just a battle for authority. It's a fight for justice, the rebirth of a community, and proof that change, though arduous, is always worth the effort. Thank you for supporting the channel. More compelling stories await you on Mr. Wisdom Story. Subscribe for the latest videos. Wishing you happiness and peace. A sweltering August morning, David Johnson, the newly appointed police chief, stepped out of an old car in the heart of Blue Ridge, a small town nestled among the misty hills of North Carolina. He wore a simple plaid shirt, faded jeans, and worn-out sneakers. He didn't look like a man who had spent 2 decades climbing the ranks in law enforcement, and that was exactly the way David wanted it. He believed that sometimes, to see things as they truly were, you had to strip away the polished veneer of scheduled meetings and choreographed welcomes. As a black man stepping into a leadership role in a region plagued by whispers of corruption and wrongdoing, he wanted to observe everything without the filters of pretense or artifice. There was no better way to do this than blending into the police station parking lot, where officers came and went, paying him no mind. David knew his appointment had only been announced a few days prior, and he had intentionally kept his arrival under wraps until the official briefing that morning. Adjusting the brim of his baseball cap, he took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his task settling on his shoulders. Though no stranger to resistance, he understood this job would test him in ways he had never imagined. David scanned the area, catching snippets of casual jokes and brief glances from officers, none of whom paused to question who he was. It was no surprise they didn't recognize him. The announcement had been sudden, and David wanted his appearance to be a complete surprise, allowing him to observe the department without the distortions of prepared welcomes or rehearsed behaviors. Suddenly, a young officer, his expression impatient, approached. The officer glanced at David with indifference before spitting on the ground near him and sneering, "Who are you? A rookie? Forget it. You're nobody." The entire parking lot fell silent for a moment as every eye turned toward them. David stood still, feeling anger rise within him, but he knew this was a pivotal moment. Reacting rashly would only escalate the situation, but staying silent would reveal something much more profound, a truth that would leave them reeling. David met the officer's gaze, then calmly wiped the spit off his face. Without a word, he turned and walked away, each step heavy with thoughts and plans already forming in his mind. He knew that by the end of the day, everything they thought about him would be upended, and the department's darkest secrets would begin to unravel. As David entered the building, the faint sounds of laughter drifted through the air. He walked through a side entrance, immersing himself in the din of casual conversations and the ring of telephones. The tiled floor gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and the stale scent of old coffee lingered in the atmosphere. David moved deliberately, his sharp eyes taking in the dynamics around him. Groups of officers huddled near desks, exchanging trivial stories, while others pored over paperwork. No one paid him any attention until he stopped near the break room. A sharp voice cut through the tense air, drawing David's attention. He turned and locked eyes with a white officer striding toward him with a smug grin that seemed to challenge everything around him. The officer's badge read Officer Daniels. Behind Daniels, a few other officers leaned against the wall, watching with amusement. David opened his mouth to speak, but before he could utter a word, Daniels cut him off, his voice dripping with arrogance. "This isn't your sanctuary," Daniels sneered. "Your mess needs to be taken somewhere else." The words hit David like a punch to the chest, momentarily rendering him motionless. He wasn't sure whether to respond immediately or let the spectacle unfold further. Before he could decide, Daniels stepped closer, his voice rising for the benefit of the growing crowd. "Did you not hear me? Get out of here." We don't need people like you hanging around. Laughter erupted, loud and taunting, as an officer smacked a desk, doubling down on the amusement. Mutters from other colleagues joined in, snide comments about teaching this nobody his place. David felt a surge of anger rise within him, his heart pounding fiercely as if it would break free from his chest. He clenched his jaw, struggling to keep the boiling fury inside him from exploding. Before he could react, Daniels leaned closer, smirking, and to everyone's shock, spat directly into David's face. Time seemed to freeze. David felt the warm spit trickle down his cheek, its filth spreading across his skin. The room erupted in louder laughter, a cacophony of jeers reverberating in the cramped space. Another officer slammed the desk again, stoking the frenzy. One more muttered something about teaching this punk a lesson. David stood still, a mix of helplessness and humiliation washing over him. Yet deep in his eyes, something burned, a quiet determination that this would not go unanswered. David's mind raced as his heartbeat thundered in his ears, but he held firm. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a handkerchief, and calmly wiped the spit from his face. Though the anger simmered within, he forced himself to remain composed, knowing an emotional reaction would only worsen the situation. He turned to Officer Daniels, his voice steady but resolute. "Is this how you treat people who walk through these doors?" Daniels smirked, a look of contempt etched across his face, before turning back to the surrounding crowd, who continued their laughter. David said nothing further. He simply turned and walked out of the room, leaving the mocking sounds behind him. He strode purposefully down the hallway, his destination clear: the department's main office. As he walked, an announcement echoed over the intercom, summoning all staff to the briefing room. It was time. The briefing room buzzed with chatter as officers filed in, some carrying coffee mugs, others cracking jokes. No one paid David any attention as he entered through a side door, holding a folder stamped with the department's official seal. He positioned himself out of sight, observing the room filled with familiar faces, some still chuckling over the earlier hallway incident. Captain Harris, a stocky man with a silver mustache, stood up and gestured for silence. "All right, settle down, everyone. We've got an important introduction today." The officers quieted, their curiosity piqued. Daniels leaned against a wall, arms crossed, the smug grin still plastered on his face, clearly pleased with his morning antics. Captain Harris cleared his throat and continued. "As most of you know, Chief Caldwell retired last month. We've been waiting for his replacement, and today, I'm pleased to introduce our new leader, someone with an impressive record and a clear vision for this department." David stepped forward, his footsteps deliberate and heavy with purpose. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as every eye turned toward him. He walked up to the podium, set the folder down carefully, and let his calm demeanor amplify the tension in the air. Uneasy glances spread throughout the room. Daniel's smirk faltered, his face slowly draining of color. David scanned the room, meeting their gazes one by one, his silence speaking louder than words. Taking a deep breath, he began in a steady, commanding voice. "My name is David Johnson. Starting today, I am your new police chief." The silence that followed was deafening. Officer Daniels' face turned a deep crimson, the self-satisfied smirk completely wiped away. David locked eyes with him, holding the stare longer than necessary before sweeping his gaze across the room. "This morning," David continued, his voice firm and even, "I came here in plain clothes because I wanted to see this department through an unfiltered lens." What I witnessed was eye-opening. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Officers exchanged uneasy glances, whispers spreading among them. David raised a hand, immediately quieting the room. "In the short time I've been here, I've seen behavior that is not just unprofessional but utterly unacceptable." David paused, letting his words settle in the air. "Let me be clear," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "The toxic culture that has been allowed to fester here ends today." The room remained eerily still. The weight of David's words hung heavy, rooting everyone in place. Daniels, standing nearby, shifted uncomfortably, his eyes fixed on the floor, unable to face the rebuke. David stepped closer to the edge of the podium, his voice sharp yet measured. Respect is not optional. It is the foundation of what we do as a law enforcement agency. Without it, we fail, not just each other, but the community we are sworn to serve. Not a sound could be heard. The tension in the room was palpable. Every officer felt the gravity of David's words, an admonition they could not ignore. This morning, some of you laughed at me, thinking I was just another powerless man placed in this position. But let me remind you, all who walk through these doors, whether they wear a badge or not, are deserving of respect. The silence was like a blade, slicing through any thought of defiance. No one dared to move. David let it linger, his unwavering gaze sweeping across the room. The tension deepened, every officer feeling as though they were being individually scrutinized. Daniels, still standing there, beads of sweat forming on his brow, could no longer hide his discomfort. David, however, was in no rush. "I understand that change is difficult," David continued, his voice steady yet commanding. "But let me make one thing absolutely clear. There will be zero tolerance for behavior that disrespects the dignity of anyone, whether they are a colleague, a civilian, or anyone else." David stepped down from the podium, moving deliberately toward the gathered officers. His presence was like a force field, drawing every eye to him. His tone softened slightly, but the authority in his words remained. "Officer Daniels," he said, stopping a few paces away. His voice sliced through the room, breaking the oppressive silence. "Stop." Daniels froze, any trace of his earlier confidence gone. He stood stiffly, unable to respond. David stared at him for a long moment, his calm demeanor radiating an intensity that seemed to strip away Daniels' bravado. "This morning, when you spat in my face, it wasn't just me you disrespected. You disrespected the badge, the oath, and the community we've sworn to protect." Daniels stammered, his voice breaking. Chief, I didn't realize," David cut him off sharply. "You didn't care to realize. You didn't take a moment to think before you acted. You assumed the man standing before you didn't matter. And that assumption, Officer Daniels, is exactly why this department has lost the trust of the community." Every word David spoke hit like a hammer, resonating throughout the room. The tension was unbearable. No one dared to speak. Each officer understood that the change David was demanding would be nothing short of transformative. The silence deepened, as if time itself had paused. Every officer stood, frozen, as though David Johnson's presence alone had made the air heavier. David shifted his gaze to the rest of the room, his expression cold and resolute. "What I witnessed this morning wasn't just the failure of one individual," he said, his voice even but piercing. "It was a culture where bullying and prejudice are not just tolerated but celebrated. That ends now." David took a step back, straightening at the podium. His eyes scanned the room, his voice rising in strength. "I've spent my entire career fighting for justice, not just on the streets, but within the walls of departments like this one. Change is never easy, and it won't happen overnight. But I promise you this, as long as I'm in charge, this department will operate with respect, integrity, and accountability." He paused, letting his words sink into the very foundation of the room. Then, turning to Captain Harris, he nodded firmly. "Effective immediately, Officer Daniels is suspended pending an internal investigation. For those of you who think this is just a slap on the wrist, think again. This is the first of many changes to come." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Daniels' face flushed red, his jaw clenched as he avoided the gaze of his colleagues. David remained unwavering, standing tall, his hand resting on the podium. "This is not about punishment," he continued, his voice unwavering. "It's about setting a standard. If you are not willing to rise to that standard, then this is not the place for you." David cast a glance around the room, the officer's eyes fixed on him, filled with worry and tension. "If you're willing to do better, we'll move forward together. But remember this, I will hold you accountable for every step you take." The meeting ended in a heavy silence. The officers left the room one by one. No words spoken, no farewells exchanged, no laughter shared. David stood firm at the podium, his eyes locked on Daniels, who trudged out, his face a mixture of confusion and anger. The other officers avoided eye contact with one another, their expressions shifting between guilt, shame, and quiet reflection. When David returned to his office, he sat at his desk and exhaled deeply. He knew this was just the beginning of a long process. Perspectives and habits ingrained over years couldn't be changed overnight, and for some, they might never change. But he hadn't come to Blue Ridge to make friends. He had come to make a difference. The phone on his desk rang. David Johnson straightened, picking up the receiver with one hand while tapping the desk lightly with the other. "I need Daniel's complete history on my desk by tomorrow. Complaints, incident reports, everything you can find." He hung up, allowing himself a brief moment of satisfaction before diving back into the paperwork piling up on his desk. He knew that in the weeks ahead, this precinct would undergo a visible transformation. Officers who once laughed at Daniel's antics now avoided him entirely. Whispered conversations about Daniel's suspension began circulating throughout the department. David decided to take a walk through the hallways, occasionally stopping to greet officers he passed. His presence served as a constant reminder of the leadership he was building. Slowly, some officers began to change their attitudes. One day, Officer Reyes, a young rookie, approached David and admitted candidly, "I went along with the toxic culture because I was afraid of retaliation. I want to do better, Chief." Her voice was earnest, her gaze steady. David looked at her, his tone gentle but resolute. "It starts with you, Reyes. But not everyone will be ready to change." Daniels, meanwhile, filed an appeal against his suspension, claiming unfair treatment. But David held firm in his decision, unwavering in his belief that accountability was non-negotiable. The days of covering up misconduct were over. Though progress was being made, David understood that the road ahead would be challenging, filled with difficult conversations about implicit bias and community relations. Resistance was inevitable, but he wasn't discouraged. With every small victory, each officer who began speaking up, each person who shifted their approach, he saw meaningful progress. One morning, David attended a community event, where a shy young boy approached him cautiously. "Are you the leader?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with wonder. "I'm Richard," David replied with a warm smile. "My dad says cops don't care about us," the boy whispered, almost timidly. David knelt down to meet the boy's gaze, his voice soft but sincere. "I can't change the past, but I promise we're working to do better." He smiled and added, "If you ever need help, don't hesitate to find me, okay?" The boy nodded, a small smile spreading across his face. Moments like these reminded David why he had taken the job in the first place. By the end of his first year, the precinct still had much work to do, but undeniable changes were taking shape. Officers unwilling to adapt were replaced by recruits who shared David's vision, a department that upheld fairness and respected the community. Those who had once doubted him now began to see the signs of transformation, a renewed effort to rebuild trust and foster unity among officers. One evening, David stood in the precinct's main hallway, watching the officers as they left their shifts. Laughter and camaraderie filled the air. Not the mocking dominance of before, but genuine connection and inclusion. He could feel the change, though he knew challenges would always remain. But for the first time, he felt hopeful. The journey was never easy, but every battle was worth it. Thank you all so much for supporting the channel. We truly appreciate each and every one of you. While creating content, there may occasionally be small mistakes, and we hope you'll bear with us. Wishing you happiness, peace, and good health in life. Stay tuned for more.